Welcome to the ninth webinar. Today we will be talking about sprint review anti-patterns. So before we start with the actual set of my dozen of sprint review anti-patterns, let's briefly have a look what the Scrum Guide is telling us about the sprint review. The sprint review is held at the end of the sprint to inspect the increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. During the sprint review, the Scrum team and the stakeholders collaborate about what was done in the sprint, which I find interesting because how can you collaborate in the sprint review about what was done in the sprint? But anyway, based on that and any changes to the product backlog during the sprint, attendees collaborate on the next thing that should be done to optimize value. This is the important thing. And I believe with regard to the importance of this, we also have a quite extensive idea within the Scrum Guide how the sprint review is supposed to look like. So it's the only event where you actually have some sort of checklist, what you're supposed to do to run this in the proper fashion. So attendees are invited by the product owner. So it's not an event the Scrum Master is supposed to facilitate, host, etc. pp. This is the task of the product owner. The product owner explains what backlog items have been done and what has not been done. The development team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it ran into, and how those problems were solved. You may remember that in the early versions of the Scrum Guide, the sprint review and the retrospective were fusioned together into one event. I think it was Ellen Gottesdiener who suggested, okay, let's split this up into two events. The development team demonstrates the work it has done and answers questions about the increment. The product owner discusses the product backlog as it stands. He or she projects likely target and delivery dates based on the progress to date, if needed. The entire group collaborates on what to do next, so that the sprint review provides valuable input for the subsequent sprint planning. This is an important issue. Sometimes people seem to postpone the sprint review after the sprint planning of the upcoming sprint, which is not a good idea because the inspection of the product increment as well as probably an adaptation of the product backlog should of course occur before the sprint planning because it has probably a direct influence on the sprint planning. So don't switch the events here. Review of how the marketplace or potential use of the product might have changed. What is the most valuable thing to do? So now the stakeholders come into the play. Review of the timeline, budget, potential capabilities, and marketplace for the next anticipated releases of functionality or capability of the product. So I think there's a reason why we have this extensive idea of how the sprint review is supposed to look in the Scrum Guide. It's the only occasion that this is happening. And I believe it's the crucial thing, and why I believe this is so important, is that it's a collaborative approach of figuring out what to build next. It's the empiricism at work, so to speak. So we had a sprint, we built something, we inspect what we built, we figured out, we share our learnings, and then we try to adapt the product backlog if necessary, which directly is going to influence the next sprint planning. So this is what it's all about. Are we still on the same track? Yes or no? And if not, how do we have to change to get back on track so that we keep, at least at this very moment in time, the potential value we will be delivering the next spring at the maximum based on what we know at this moment in time. However, it's not a demo. It's not a sprint demo. Sometimes you see people refer to the sprint review as a sprint demo. This is really not what it's about. A sprint demo is maybe show some of the stuff that you built, but the focus is really on getting the product backlog adapted if required. Number one, no sprint review. All Scrum events are essential for a team's success. You cannot just skip an event. You can observe, however, that junior Scrum teams may be tempted to skip the sprint review. For example, they need a bit more time to accomplish the sprint goal. This is problematic for several reasons. For example, it's way too late to make this decision, right? So if you find out in the middle of the sprint that you probably will not be able to make the sprint call because you have run into some issues you couldn't foresee, for example, some technical debt or people got sick or whatever, then would be a good time to start renegotiating with the product owner what you possibly can take out of the sprint backlog in order to still meet the sprint goal. Right? What you don't do is basically skip Scrum events to save a bit of time. This is really not the way that Scrum is supposed to work. And if that is happening, please have the sprint review and use the upcoming retrospective to figure out what went wrong. And if you have this under control and what you can probably change to prevent this from happening again and during the next sprint. Another issue is probably that you have nothing to show. The point is you have to answer the question where you really have nothing done. Absolutely nothing. I would say this is precisely the reason why you should have a sprint review, because there must be something wrong with your sprint backlog. Probably the product backlog refinement wasn't working out. There were misunderstandings, etc. pp. And you certainly want to communicate that to your stakeholders. Remember, it's all about openness, creating transparency. Without transparency, inspection and adaptation. And without inspection and adaptation, there won't be trust built between all the parties. And this is an essential part of this. If you didn't manage to get anything done during the sprint, be open about it, and change your attitude and your approach to this in the next sprint. This may also be fueled from the misperception that you can only show front-end heavy tasks. So some buttons you can click on or whatever, you can show some new functionality. This is absolutely not true. Spoiler alert, you can also show, for example, APIs, and you can even do this at a command line level. The idea that you don't want to bother stakeholders with back-end issues is completely wrong. In my experience is that stakeholders are actually also interested in this part of the application building because they actually want to know and have some insight. And they're totally fine with looking at the command line if you explain this accordingly. So it's very hard from my perspective to find a reason to not have the sprint review in the first place. And absolutely, we didn't build anything is certainly one of the lesser explanations why you should do this. Number 2, reporting session. Every task accomplished is demoed, and probably the stakeholders will not take this enthusiastically. We're not accountants. Having a detailed report on what issues the money was spent does not make our customers happy, and there's no justification needed. Think of sunk costs, it's water under the bridge. The money is gone anyway. What we are interested in is the learning. Are we still on the right track? Do we need to change? I know it's satisfying to show a list of stuff that you built. It feels good. You have some sort of dopamine rush and it's a good feeling. However, this is not the purpose of the sprint review. Always like to come back. It's about figuring out collectively, are we still on the right track? So my tip to avoid this, consider telling a compelling story at the beginning of the review to engage the stakeholders and leave out those tasks that are not really relevant to the story. It's not about accuracy and delivering a perfect report where the money went. Number 3, death by slide deck. Participants are bored to death by PowerPoint. Okay. Agreed. We need to check the backlog. But checking the backlog in this situation does not mean using Jira, Excel, or PowerPoint. For example, you also could recreate the current product backlog items on stickies and put them on the wall. Or if you have a copy of that on your wall anyway, just move it to the area where the sprint review is taking place so everyone can see what is currently available in a product backlog to inspect it at a later stage. Other suggestions. It's truly about show, don't tell. And if you would like to take this a step further, consider about giving the helm to the stakeholders. Why not let them try out new things and be surprised how this is working and let them discover on their own what you built. This usually is a good idea. Or another situation, if you're working with several teams on the issue on the product, create some sort of science fair. Have small booths where the teams are located and the stakeholders can walk around and have a look at the different issues and the different parts of the product increment the teams built. So no death by PowerPoint. It's annoying and it's not contributing to the reputation of this important event. Number 4, side gigs. The development team increases the scope of the sprint without prior consulting the product owner by adding unnecessary work to the sprint backlog items. We also refer to this as scope stretching or gold plating. This ignorance may result in a questionable allocation of resources. Let me give you one example. A few years ago, we decided to add authentication of users via OpenID. And when the developer showed what he built at the end of the sprint, I was surprised that he built something that could handle multiple OpenIDs and administrate those. And at the time, it was a rare occasion that a user had one OpenID. So I think he had a lot of fun building this kind of system. I'm sure it was one of the very few applications of handling multiple OpenIDs to provide authentication of users at the time, but I think we spent quite some time on this, completely useless. So what I would like to suggest in these cases, if you run into this, make sure that the developers and the product owner spend more time on talking to each other. Shouldn't your product owner be co-located with a team? Well, now would be a good time to reconsider this. And there's another question. Is there probably enough slack time for the engineers? Maybe they just want to test new tech and got carried away by this way. So it's not so easy that they build something you cannot use and you have to throw away. If you're a Scrum Master, and please dive into this, why this happened and how you could prevent this in the future. Number 5, low attendance rate from the development team. Probably always the same members from the development team who participate. The problem is that the fewer the number of participating development team members is, it also reduces the level of transparency. A reduced level of transparency on the engineering side may result in a flawed inspection of both the product increment and the product backlog as well. It may also result in an inferior adaptation of the product backlog. The issue is that you actually cannot enforce the team's participation in the sprint review either. I mean, you can't drag them to the sprint review. They need to be intrinsically motivated to do so. They need to be motivated to participate in the sprint review. You're just ordering them will not deliver this either. The only way out of this, in my experience, is that you make it interesting enough so that everyone from the development team is interested in participating. Number 6, works on my machine. That's a simple one. The development team shows stuff that is not done. All work shown at the sprint review needs to meet the definition of done. That provides the transparency to the product owner. He or she needs to understand that the product increment is potentially releasable and that the release is possible at any time at the discretion of the product owner. This is really at the core of Scrum. Whatever you define as done needs to be done by the standard. Otherwise, you create havoc and it's really breaking apart. So do not show anything that is not done, that it's not meeting the definition of done criteria. But that's a simple one. If this is happening, it's a good topic for a retrospective. Number 7, no stakeholders. The stakeholders do not attend the sprint review. And this typically creates an unhealthy bubble for the Scrum team due to the disconnect to the stakeholders. So we've been briefly talking about that earlier today already. In my experience, there are several reasons why stakeholders might not attend the sprint review. For example, they do not see any value in the ceremony. This is certainly an issue that the Scrum Master, but also the rest of the Scrum team needs to address. Another reason would be related, but not identical. They do not understand the importance of the sprint review event. Again, this may be rooted in a more waterfall approach, in an understanding that this is more of silos talking to each other, or that there are handovers involved. So the stakeholders are not yet that familiar with Scrum, so they may be confused about all the ceremonies and may not realize how important their participation is. Probably it's simpler than that. There might be conflict with a more critical meeting from their perspective. I mean, you can't be in two places at the same time. So maybe you just find a different slot in the calendar for your sprint review. Nevertheless, in my experience, you need to sell the sprint review to the organization, particularly at the beginning of a transformation, and it'll take time. If you're really fast and it's really quickly understood, it's probably 3 months. It's more likely to be 4 to 6 months until the stakeholders fully appreciate, embrace, and get involved in the sprint review. It just takes some time. Training, education, going back to them over and over again. And this is a crucial part that the Scrum Master, as well as the product owner and the rest of the team, should team up for and figure out an appropriate strategy to handle this. So what we did, for example, in one project at the beginning, we gave away small jobs, so to speak. So 1 point story, something around that, to the stakeholders who appeared at the meeting at the sprint review. Okay, it was a bit of bribing them. It was certainly not according to the Scrum Guide, but it worked out well. So because they now had a chance to get some small stuff placed into the next sprint, and then they were able to brag about this. We stopped doing that after 3-4 months because then everyone understood how important the meeting is and they voluntarily showed up. Sometimes bribing is okay, but don't tell anyone. Number 8, the sprint Stagegate. The sprint review is a kind of Stagegate approval process where stakeholders sign off features. This anti-pattern is typical for organizations that are still rooted in the industrial paradigm, exercising command and control, rooted in this my budget, my feature idea. The Scrum team may probably be regarded more as a kind of internal agency. You have to engage to get your things done as a stakeholder. I wouldn't rule out that there might be some kind of metered funding approach practice on top of this Stagegate anti-pattern. In this case, I would suggest that you strongly reconsider your approach to becoming agile. Maybe you might be inclined to start over because you're actually practicing some kind of water scrum fall. Just to remind you of the Scrum Guide, it's the prerogative of the product owner to decide what is going to ship and what will be accepted. There's no other party involved in that. The Scrum Guide mentions that the product owner might be influenced by a committee when it comes to ordering the product backlog and deciding what would be valuable to be built next. But as far as the acceptance is concerned, it's only the product owner. Number 9, the silent treatment. The stakeholders are passive and unengaged. Tricky thing when the Scrum team is supposed to collaborate with the stakeholders to figure out what to build next. There are some ways how you can adjust this. First of all, you can't mention this often enough, educating the stakeholders about the importance of the sprint review and their role. Maybe they need more training. Maybe they need encouragement. Maybe it helps to have the sponsor from the C-level attending your sprint reviews. Be creative about this. If they like muffins, get some muffins. Just try to sell the event itself. Secondly, what's really working nicely is let the stakeholders drive the sprint review and put them at the helm. It's not just show and tell, but just let them figure out what you built and whether this is meeting their expectations and whether they see value in that. And again, a small science fair always makes sense. So even if you have just 2 or 3 teams working on the application, it's already creating a different environment. It's more fun that way. It's also not some sort of broadcasting, but you walk around and you check out different booths, and it really worked nicely. By the way, what I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this is just working out provided your stakeholders are not just sending some proxies to participate in the sprint review. You need the original, so to speak, not just a poor trainee who is tasked with go to the sprint review and write down what they're telling you, and report back to me. This is not working. You need to have the real folks from the stakeholder side at the meeting. Number 10, the omniscient product owner. I know what we have to build. Follow me. The product owner has no doubt about where to go. He or she does not need the team, doesn't require the stakeholders. Collaboration would only slow him or her down. Product owner provides the why, how, and what at the same time. This is really a problematic situation, particularly if you mix a dominant product owner with a submissive team and absent stakeholders. That's a horrible combination if you want to have an inspection and an adaptation in answering the are we still on the right tech question, because it will always end up with the product owner showing the way and defining what needs to be built next from his or her perspective. The checks and balances are gone this way. Too bad that Scrum thrives on exactly the equilibrium of all the roles and the stakeholders. Number 11, the selfish product owner. This sprint I delivered. Spoiler alert again, there is no I in team. The Scrum team wins, the Scrum team loses. The sprint review is the moment to shine for the development team and surprise customers and stakeholders. And it's absolutely not a show to praise the product owner. So if you hear this as a Scrum Master in the sprint review, you have some work to do. And you have to figure out why this is happening. Maybe it's the individual itself. Maybe there are other issues. And you really need to dig into this because this is in the midterm really ruining the whole experience. Number 12, the broadcasting product owner. A sprint review is a regular repeating opportunity to realign the Scrum team with customers and stakeholders to answer the simple question. What are we building next? Are we still on the right track? We've been there a few times before. This requires the collaboration from all participants, not just a product owner broadcasting a decision already made in advance. The situation when actually all decisions have already been made and it's more kind of confirmation event. If the product owner is not seeking feedback actively, the whole purpose of the sprint review is missed. And the sprint review itself is turned into some kind of waste. So this is partly overlapping with the selfish product owner, but it's not completely the same. I don't want to end with a product owner bashing here, but as you know, the product owner is the Achilles heel of the Scrum team anyway by design. From a stakeholder perspective, he or she is probably the single wringable neck. I think it's one of the major tasks that the Scrum Master is facing, that turning the different people into a team, a real team, not just a group of people who happen to be at the same time in the same place following the same goal. And getting the product owner on your side is very important. That was my dirty dozens of sprint review anti-patterns. Let me quickly wrap up. You decide not to have a sprint review at all. You postpone it, for example, or you cancel it. The sprint review turns into a reporting session. Keep in mind, we're not accountants. It's death by PowerPoint. Instead of showing, not telling people something, you find out that the development team did some extra work. You have no clue they would provide to you, and it's questionable that was a good idea. The engineers are bored. They rather do something else than attending the sprint review, or they show something that is not really done, worked on my machine, the typical excuse. Or you run into no stakeholders actually appear, or the stakeholders who appear turn the sprint review in some sort of Stagegate approval process, and probably you get the silent treatment. So the stakeholders are not engaging at all, or probably they send some proxies who have no clue what they're supposed to do, who just take notes. And we ended with the critical role of the product owner. So you have the omniscient product owner who knows exactly what to do next. And actually the sprint review is more a nuisance and distraction. We have the selfish product owner who tries to sell everything as his or her personal achievement. Remind you, it's called Scrum Team. The team wins, the team loses. Or you have the broadcasting product owner, making this a rather unpleasant situation. So thank you for attending the 9th Hands-on Agile webinar on sprint review anti-patterns, and probably see you on November 27th.